Hello, and welcome back to the Reconciliation Project podcast, where we're informed by faith and informed by science. I'm Hunter.
And I'm Sam.
And in today's episode, we're going to be looking at Darwin's evidence for evolution. So talking about specifically what he observed on the Galapagos Islands when he did his travels. He made a lot of observations when he was there. And from what he observed, he formulated what we now know as the theory of evolution. In 1859, Charles Darwin published his book entitled On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. But now we all are familiar with the shortened title of simply The Origin of Species. And this book was basically a culmination of his discoveries on the Galapagos Islands off the coast of Ecuador. So if you want to start us off talking about a little bit more about his travels?
Yeah, absolutely. So Darwin was actually aboard the Her Majesty's vessel, or HMS Beagle, from 1831 until 1836. And he actually was on board as the ship's naturalist. He was basically there to take samples. They were essentially trying to map the coastline of South America for the British Navy. And after this voyage, Darwin brought back some of the samples that he took to England, where he noticed differences, and that was what helped him develop his theory regarding evolution. The Galapagos was a stop on the way back, and the Galapagos were really ideal to study changes in species. The archipelago of the Galapagos is roughly 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador, and there's no evidence geologically that these islands were ever connected to the mainland or connected to each other. The archipelago is also roughly 300 miles across, so fairly large span of area. It's made up of 61 islands and islets, with 13 of those being the main islands that we know. The islands are also separated by ocean currents, which makes migration between the islands really difficult. These are also volcanic islands, which allows them to have their own microclimates, so really varied despite geographic location being relatively similar.
Yeah, they all have their essentially kind of different environment on each island, depending on which one you go to. They're all a little different. And when he was going through these islands, he observed a variety of species in the Galapagos archipelago, and he noticed their differences from those similar organisms on the mainland. We're all familiar with Darwin's finches. That's, I would think, his most popular subject to study. And we all know specifically he looked at their beak. They all had those different beaks depending on which island they were on, and that corresponded to the food on the island that they lived on. Some had bigger beaks, some had smaller beaks, some had longer beaks, some had shorter beaks, just depending on which island they were on. And it showed how those populations had adapted to the food source that was on their island. And he also observed tortoises. Specifically, he looked at their shells and their physical features, and in doing so, he noticed that those were slightly different depending on which island they were on, depending on their habitat. And that also showed how the tortoises had changed over time to adapt to their specific island environment. He also observed some South American fossils on his travels, and what he saw was that the fossils of extinct giant mammals were very similar to animals living at that time in the exact same region. And he also found some wildlife to be uniquely adapted to the environment so that they filled ecological roles or niches that other unrelated animals fill in other environments in other parts of the world. So basically what this means is he observed some animals filling or fulfilling a particular role in their environment that in other parts of the world, completely unrelated animals were fulfilling that same role. So what he saw was two completely different animals doing the same role in a completely different environment based solely on how they adapted and how they responded to what their environment was like. And this ultimately, throughout all his travels, he took all of this information and ultimately came up with the theory of evolution that we know of today.
Yeah, so this brings us back to what we discussed in episode 3 with Darwin's theory of evolution, which is that favorable adaptations possessed by individuals would allow them to survive and pass on those traits, while those without those favorable adaptations would die and not be able to pass on their traits. This would lead to an overall population with a higher frequency of these favored adaptations or traits, quote unquote, which would then lead to a population that overall had adapted.
Yeah, so sometimes we see Darwin's idea of natural selection being called survival of the fittest. Which is somewhat of a misnomer, but it comes from the idea that those who are most capable of adapting or responding to their environment survive. They live on, they reproduce, and eventually they kind of take over and become dominant in the population. Whereas those who don't have those favored traits or adaptations or just can't adapt to their environment, they eventually get replaced. And sometimes this doesn't even occur because an animal just couldn't adapt. It can sometimes occur simply because one part of the population had a selective advantage over another part. We talked about the giraffes that Lamarck used in his idea for evolution. And he talked about the giraffes that could reach the higher food sources had a competitive advantage over giraffes that couldn't reach higher food sources. So those traits got passed on. So, like I said, sometimes it's simply just who has the advantage. And while, yes, sometimes natural selection just involves, okay, who actually has the traits needed to survive in this environment. Others, it's who has the traits needed to better survive in the environment. So it's a difference between can they just simply survive or can they just survive? And on top of that, they also have something that gives them some sort of advantage, whether it be with finding food sources or evading predators or reproducing better or whatever it may be.
Absolutely. That's a good distinction. And we do see this type of natural selection and this type of adaptation happening today, most notably with bacteria. Bacteria do have very short life cycles and reproductive cycles, so we can see them adapt fairly quickly, usually within the span of a couple days, given that they reproduce within, depending on the species of bacteria, within 20 minutes or so. So we do see this happening, and that's more on the microevolution scale. That said, Darwin really took this a step further and suggested that over time, these small changes could give rise to completely different groups of animals, and essentially claiming that all life could have come from a single point or a single common ancestor. Now, this type of thinking is fairly common today. Scientists will observe something and extrapolate it in order to answer an unknown. And this happens everywhere, and it's kind of how science works. The problem is if you extrapolate it too far.
So in this case, when talking about evolution, we're looking at how scientists have extrapolated to explain the origins of the diversity of life. That's one common thing that we see in these debates with evolution is people sometimes attack evolution and say that, well, you can't explain how everything came about. Well, evolution doesn't actually try to explain the origins of life. It's trying to explain the diversity of life. Basically, we have multiple millions of species of animals. How did we get all the diversity? And that's where evolution comes in. And we see this extrapolation happening in every field of science. There's nothing wrong per se with extrapolating because science is all about discovering what's unknown. And by making a hypothesis based on what we do know, we are sort of extrapolating and then formulating hypotheses and tests and trying to either see if we were right or we were wrong and what have you. But the problem is, like you said, is if you extrapolate too far. And we see that when Darwin published his ideas, he extrapolated far beyond the scientific understanding of his time, which, again, nothing necessarily inherently wrong with what he was saying. But like I said, he went far beyond what science knew at the time.
And we would see some fields of study come into existence that would pose challenges to his theory.
So at his time, cell theory was just starting to become a thing. We had just recently seen Antoine von Leeuwenhoek coin the term cells after looking at cells under a microscope. And when this happened, and when cells were just starting to become known to be a thing, we didn't know much about them. We didn't know much about the contents of the cells, or in other words, we just didn't know what made them up. We simply could just see these little box-looking things under a microscope, but we didn't know what was going on inside those at the time.
In fact, many scientists held to the idea that they were just giant blobs of jelly or goo or whatever. They didn't think that there was anything more to them than that.
Yeah, and this is actually something, even today, we're still discovering the complexity of the cell membrane. And the protein and lipid interactions that we see on the membrane itself. We're just now beginning to understand the biochemistry of how these two interact to help the cell function. And that's just one part of the cell. We also, at this time, he also didn't know anything about the contents of the nucleus or really anything of how the cell worked other than the cell existed. We also know that Gregor Mendel was at this time conducting his pea plant experiments. This is where we first see the rise of genetics and learning how traits are passed down over time. Because at this time, originally it was thought that it was the proteins that carried the genetic information of life. It wasn't until after Mendel and several decades of other scientific experiments that we found that it was actually DNA that carried the information for life. At this time, there was also no knowledge whatsoever of molecular mechanisms inside the cell, like I was talking about a little bit with the membrane, but there was also no understanding of how, obviously they didn't know about DNA at the time, but they obviously also wouldn't have known about how DNA replicates, how proteins are formed, things like that. And there's also no knowledge of molecular genetics, or really molecular biology as a whole. Molecular biology is a relatively new field, even today. And biochemistry as a field was still yet to emerge. So at Darwin's time, we thought that life was much more simple, that there wasn't a lot that made up what makes up us. So when he proposed his theory, it would be a lot easier to propose all of this happening by simple guidance of natural selection mutation and randomness, essentially, when there's not much making it up. But as we've gone in the past 150 years, more than that actually, since Darwin published his ideas, we've discovered how complex cells are, how complex biological processes are, and how complex even the most simple bacteria are. And it does pose some challenges to evolution that scientists have tried to address, and many will say they have well addressed them. But we would argue that that's not actually the case.
And there are still quite a few issues with that. In fact, just making the comment of, oh, well, we didn't understand how complex everything was at the time automatically disproves evolution isn't entirely correct. We see evolution happening. So we know to some extent it does still happen. And that's not to say that, oh, everything just doesn't make sense here. A lot of it does make sense. But the farther you go with complexity in where we are today, with what we're discovering in how complex cells are, in how complex organisms are, heck, even how complex ecology is, that makes it very difficult to keep going back on the evolutionary scale to say, oh, well, this just happened, without giving some sort of reasoning as to how it happened or by what mechanism, which we're still not seeing much of that happening. There are very few papers that describe or even suggest possible methods of how certain biological systems gave rise, or how certain proteins came into existence, or so on and so forth. So there's a lot that poses, like you said, a lot of issues with that.
Yeah, and we're not trying to say that complexity in itself automatically disproves evolution and we can just forget it. I'm not trying to say that at all. But what I am saying is when you see and continue to see the increasing complexity of life in whatever field of biology you look, you have to go back to your existing theories and say, okay, does this theory hold up with what we're seeing? And I would say in a lot of cases, evolution does. It's when you start getting into those far extrapolated points that it begins to fall apart, in our view.
Absolutely. Now, going back to Darwin's theory, he also proposed what we now know of as the falsification criteria. He basically said, and this is a quote from his book, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Basically what he's saying here is if there is anything whatsoever that's part of a biological system that could not have had this little bit done to it first, and then this little bit, and then this little bit, and then it became its own fully functioning thing with successive, what it calls slight modifications, this theory wouldn't work. That said, there are systems that work like that. We refer to these systems under the nomer of irreducible complexity. Now, we're not going to cover irreducible complexity in huge detail here. We'll cover it in more detail in a future episode. But irreducible complexity is basically the idea that a multi-part system or feature can't function as it does if one of those parts is removed. And we do see some of these systems even within the human body. The way Darwin's theory of evolution is described, if the whole organ or system or process or what have you doesn't work, it can't necessarily be favorable, and therefore it can't be passed on with greater frequency as directed by natural selection. So point being, Darwin's falsification criteria does have somewhat of an answer in irreducible complexity. Again, we'll cover it in more detail in a future episode, so hold tight on that. But we are seeing some issues continue to arise with Darwin's theory of evolution.
Yeah, and I would also point out, and I might get some heat from my creationist friends for saying that Darwin was a pretty good scientist, I would say. I think he did a pretty good job in observing what he saw at the Galapagos Islands and creating a hypothesis and theory based on what he observed. And I think we can all agree, regardless of how you view it, the theory of evolution was very groundbreaking and still is, as it does explain how everything came about, how diversity came about. And in his book, a lot of what he said makes sense in light of even today's biology. Because like we said, we can see these changes happening over time. We can see populations evolving today. We can see the results of changes over time and species adapting. We can see that. We can observe it. And he even went as far as to make the claim that we all know that everything came from a common ancestor. And at his time, okay, that's fine. But as science has continued to evolve, funnily enough, we've seen more and more come up that raises issues. And I'm not going to say disproves his idea, because I don't think, I would think most of his theory is pretty accurate. I don't think there's anything wrong with most of what he said. I think, like we said, where the problem comes in is where you extrapolate to, okay, now this is how everything came from a universal common ancestor that existed on Earth billions of years ago. That's a pretty far extrapolation, far beyond what anything in biology can do or tell. And while we can observe evolution today, we can't observe these big changes that Darwin said should happen if his theory is true. And I say all this to say that while Darwin, yes, had a great idea based on what he was observing, and most of what he says still holds up, some of it doesn't.
And evidence for his large scale evolution doesn't hold up and is posing more issues.
So to kind of sum up what we've been talking about, the point of this discussion today was to look at what Darwin observed and the evidence that he had in his time for his theory, which, like we said,
was limited.
It was limited. He had some good evidence in terms of diversity. He had good evidence in terms of adaptation. And from what he saw, he said, you know what, I think the environment determines who survives and who doesn't. And well, you know, that's something we see today. I think that's something that's happened through all of Earth's history, is what could survive lived, what couldn't die.
Because the animal kingdom is brutal.
Yeah, it is very, very brutal.
Watch anything on Nat Geo that's narrated by David Attenborough, and you'll come to that same conclusion.
And that actually puts to a good visualization of why it's so important to be able to adapt, to be able to deal with predation, to be able to deal with changes in the environment, such as something humans have caused deforestation.
Lack of food.
Or cutting food sources, or pollution in the oceans, whatever it may be. And kind of a negative thing on how humans have done with the environment. Humans have done a lot of things to the environment that animals have had to adapt to. And I think it's fair to say, I could be wrong, but I think it's fair to say that we have some organisms who are at least on the brink of extinction because of how humans have not cared for the environment.
Multiple.
And it wouldn't surprise me if, like I said, I'm not an ecologist, so I don't know for sure, but it wouldn't surprise me if there were species that have gone extinct because of how humans have failed to take care of the environment. And humans, I think, have put a big stretch on, I want to say they're naturally selecting, but I guess they've sped up natural selection in a way and selected in ways the environment wouldn't actually do.
That's actually a great point. For example, there was a species of bird called the passenger pigeon, and they're called passenger pigeon because when they would nest or they would roost, they would land on top of each other to sleep. So they would stack, almost like Lincoln logs type thing. And that was a detriment to them in terms of predation from humans, because humans could shoot a bunch of them all at once because they were all stacked on top of each other, and they're now extinct.
Yeah, so overall, we can see how humans have sped up natural selection or changed how the environment would select, whatever the best way to put that is. But the whole point of bringing it up is the environment changes, regardless of what's causing it, whether it be human activity or a natural disaster or whatever it might be. The environment changes over time. And like we've talked about, we can simulate this on a petri dish with bacteria. So the overall idea, if they can adapt to those changes, they survive. If they can't, they die off. Very simple concept, I would say, and it's something that we can observe easily. And that, as the mechanism for evolution in terms of change over time, I think is a very valid, biologically accurate conclusion. But going to the point of saying this can lead to
a bacteria turning into a human.
Yeah, obviously that's a big stretch that I don't think any evolutionist would say happens, but over time, the molecules to man idea, going to that point with natural selection, I don't think makes sense biologically. And I don't think that's a statement of me just not being willing to listen to what biology says. I've studied biology. I've studied genetics. I've got a good base of knowledge in biology. as do you. This isn't okay, I just don't know. I'm basing that statement based on what I do know about biology. And I would say I know more than the average person you'd walk up to in a supermarket.
Mm-hmm. Unless that person has a PhD.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to bash anybody like that, but I'm basically trying to say I'm not saying these things because I just don't know or not willing to know. I'm saying it because of what I know. And that's another interesting thing with evolution and science as a whole. There's a lot of accounts that people have in their life where they've came to faith because of what science has said. Science does have the ability to lead people to faith. Mm-hmm. It has on numerous occasions. And some of these people are people who set out to disprove creation or Christianity or the Bible or whatever it may be. And yet they still found faith because of what they learned in science. Mm-hmm. So I say all that to say this. I think science supports creation and design more than evolution. And I'm saying that based on what I know of science. Mm-hmm. If you follow the science, just plain and simple as it is, it's going to lead you one of two ways. But in some cases, we have seen people go down the creation route. Mm-hmm. Simply by studying what science says. Mm-hmm. So it is possible to look at science and just say, hey, you know what, I see design. Mm-hmm. It's not unheard of. It's not something that the church has just come up with to try to
throw everyone off.
Or to say, oh, science is of the devil. That's not true. I would say science is a great way to learn about God and to learn more about the Bible. Mm-hmm. But anyway, yeah, science can point us in that direction as well. It's not unheard.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's going to cover our episode for today. In our next episode, we are going to be covering more evolutionary topics. That said, we do need to understand a little bit about how genetics plays a role in evolution. We started some of that by discussing Gregor Mendel earlier in this episode, so we'll probably be covering that in a little bit more detail. But we hope that you will join us next time for evolution and genetics.